We're commemorating the bicentenary of the publication of the history of the town and county of the town of Galway. My name is Daniel Carey. I'm director of the Moore Institute at NUI Galway. Thank you, as I say, for joining us. This special event has been devised and organized by John Cunningham, our colleague in the School of History and Philosophy. So without further ado, I'll hand over to John.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Dan. Anyway, if I may, I'll start by quoting James Hardiman on this occasion. So here we go. Galway is advantageously situated on the side of a broad and rapid river to which it gives name, and by which the extensive Lake Corrib pours its redundant waters into the ocean. It is distant from Dublin in nearly a direct line, about 101 Irish miles, and is the most westerly town of consequence in Europe. The town itself, to which vessels of upwards of 400 tons burden can come up, is admirably situated for commerce with Europe and the Indies. Right, so those lines are from Hardiman's History of the Town and the County of the Town of Galway, published exactly 200 years ago. And I should mention that the book itself is available free online through the Ask About Ireland website. Of course, it's the anniversary, the bicentenary, that brings us together here. A seminar which we'd planned has, because of circumstances in the world, become a webinar. So you're stepping with us into this brave new world. I haven't moderated a webinar before, and I expect it's the first time that some others of you have participated in one. For getting it this far, I thank the Moore Institute, Moore Director Dan Carey, you've met, and behind the scenes, Martha Shaughnessy and David Kelly. The panellists in today's discussion, who I'll be introducing in a moment, are all contributors to a forthcoming book commemorating Hardiman's history. The book is called Hardiman and Beyond, Galway Arts and Culture 1820 to 2020. And I'm one of its two editors, John Cunningham, alongside Ciaran McDonough. I think the cover may have flashed up earlier. Now, starting with Hardiman himself, our book covers cultural and artistic endeavour in the city through the Gaelic revival of a century ago, right up to the era of the Arts Festival, Druid, Dedanan and Stunning, and the ill-starred Galway 2020 indeed. Today we're focusing on Hardiman at his times of roughly 200 years ago, but if there's an appetite for further webinars on the more recent cultural history of Galway, we're ready and we're willing. In the meantime, you might like to know that there's a facility for asking questions or commenting, either typing them in using the chat function or by raising a virtual hand, which you can do on the right hand of the screen. I hope to take some questions from the participants in the second half of the proceedings. And if you have friends who might like to see this later on, it'll be on the Moore Institute Facebook page. I think it's some of you may be watching it through that, and also on the Moore Institute's YouTube channel. So without further ado, I'll introduce the panel. Dr. Ciaran McDonough, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the Moore Institute. She's an authority on 19th century Aquarianism, among other things. And Ciaran, as I said, is my co-editor on the forthcoming book. Mary Boran is a special collections librarian in the James Hardiman Library, and she has written extensively on James Hardiman's life and career. Like Hardiman, she came to Galway from Mayo, as far as I know. Next, I'll introduce Dr. Jimmy O'Brien Moran. He's a lecturer in the Waterford Institute of Technology. He's a former Fulbright scholar, and he's a noted uilleann piper. He has recorded an album of the music of Galway piper Paddy Connealy, who was a protege of Hardiman's. Next, Professor Lillis O'Leary teaches in Ryan na Gaeilge, NUI Galway. Like James Hardiman in his day, Lillis is a member of the Royal Irish Academy. He's also a noted traditional singer, and I'll be coaxing a song from him later on. Finally, Dr. Nollaig O'Morila was a colleague of Lillis's in Ryan na Gaeilge, and is also a member of Acadamh Riaga na hÉireann, the Royal Irish Academy. He too is from Mayo. Of his many publications, I'll mention one, Leabhar na Nionalach, the great book of Irish genealogies. So with the introductions out of the way, I'll get straight to my first question to open the proceedings, as it were, and I'm directing that to Ciaran. Really, just tell us, who was James Hardiman, Ciaran?
Well, Hardiman was a 19th century scholar with a variety of research interests. He focused mainly on Irish language sources. He was a manuscript collector and indeed a dealer. He was a key figure in helping official government sources and local government sources, and using those in the aiding of his history, in writing his histories. He, was also a famous Latinist, so he used a lot of kind of non-Irish sources in compiling his histories. He was born in Westport in Mayo in around the year 1782. A later letter from 1852 he claims that he was within a pop of 70, so this is a rough guess at his age and the year he was born. And he was born to parents either a Thomas or a Richard a Hardigoin, who was from County Meath. Hardiman claims that he was from Nobber and that he was an acquaintance of the famous harper Sir Carolan. His mother was from Erith in Mayo, and she was called either Marcella or Marjorie Hall. Hardiman suffered an accident in one eye when he was 2, and that kind of puts an end to what could have been a promising career in the priesthood. And he moved to Galway at the age of 8, and which O'Donovan claimed, one of his biographers, was a town celebrated for its classical learning, and it's assumedly here that the course of his future life was laid before him.
So
thanks, Ciaran. If I can go to Mary Boran. He didn't stay in Galway through all his early years. Is that right, Mary?
That's correct, John. Yes, he was educated in Galway, but we're not absolutely sure where, although he does make reference in later life and in letters and so on to various people with whom he was educated, and that he was still acquainted with much later. But the first kind of content that we have relating to his education really is when he was admitted to the King's Inns in Dublin to study law in 1809. And that does mention his parents' names and that his father had a shop in Galway. So he was educated there, but then sometime after that, he took up employment with the newly established commissioners for the public records in Ireland. And he was one of the sub-commissioners, as they were called. And basically, they were trying to put in order all of the administrative records, the original documents that were held in Dublin Castle and various other buildings relating to the English administration in Ireland from the medieval period onwards. And a report had indicated that some of these were very poorly managed and preserved and stored and so on. So this commission was established and he was one of the employees. And the annual reports of that body exist from, the first one was published in 1813, right up to the late 1820s. And it gives details of the work that they carried out. And in fact, there are some appendices to the reports written by Hardiman describing the documents that he was working on and the work of calendaring and preparing, sort of catalogues, I suppose, really, of documents. So he spent a good deal of time at that in Dublin. It's pretty clear, though, that he was doing other things at the same time, including practicing as a lawyer. And he's listed, for example, in the Pigot's Directory from 1824 as an attorney in Dublin, and it gives his address and so on. And he mentions himself in a footnote in the history of Galway, that he's one of the attorneys in Galway when the book was published in 1820. And he mentions that there were upwards of 30 attorneys in the town at the time. So he seems to have been a man of many parts, I think. And you know, he lived between Galway and Dublin, as far as I can establish anyway, until he finally built a house in Galway in the 1830s.
Thank you, Mary. Thanks. So I'll move on now to Nollaig. Hardiman's era really is the late 18th and early 19th century. So maybe you could talk us through the Galway of that era as revealed in his classic history and indeed in other sources. So Nollaig.
Right, John. Well, first of all, as we've heard, Hardiman's history was published. It was published actually at his own expense in the year 1820. That, we should remember, was just 20 years after the brutal and traumatic year of the French and the subsequent in 1798 and the subsequent Act of Union, which carried, we may remember, the promise of Catholic emancipation, a promise that was broken. And Daniel O'Connell's great campaign on the issue had yet to begin. The campaign for Catholic emancipation would eventually be crowned a success, but not until 1829. So 1820 was a time when national morale, you could say, was at a low ebb. And a Catholic like Hardiman, even one comfortably off with a government job in Dublin Castle as Deputy Commissioner of Public Records, would be well advised to keep his head down and not rock the boat or antagonise the then ruling elite. In his history, Hardiman's coverage of 17th century Galway, for example, emphasises the injustices suffered by local Catholic landowners during the Cromwellian era, and is critical of the restored monarch Charles II for his perceived duplicity in failing to overturn the Cromwellian settlement. It also reflects the popular support for King James II and laments the crushing of Catholic hopes in the tragic battle on what he calls the memorable plains of Aughrim. That was in 1691. But there's a marked change of tone when it comes to the 18th century, with Hardiman singing the praises of what he calls the illustrious House of Hanover, and in particular the happy accession of his present Majesty, that's George III, to the throne of these realms. Referring to the landing of the French at Connealy in August 1798, he mentions, quote, the gallant and humane General Hutchinson, who was aided by the merchants of Galway to join General Lake in marching to meet the enemy. And the enemy here meant General Humbert and his Mayo allies, the men of the West, who famously routed Generals Hutchinson's and Lake's redcoats in the races of Castlebar. So, really, leaving that aside, the chief value of the work then is in Hardiman's account, I think, of various aspects of the city of Galway as it was at the time of writing. But Ciaran and Mary will be speaking on that topic in a moment. Another aspect of Hardiman in which I have a particular interest is his relationship with the brilliant scholar John O'Donovan, who, as you probably know, was a noted expert on the place names of Ireland, on medieval Irish literature, the history of early to late medieval Ireland, and various other areas of learning. In fact, Hardiman was O'Donovan's first employer. From 1827 to 29, he hired O'Donovan to copy documents in Latin, English, and Irish. Some of this was to do with his work in the record office, and others was to do with his preparations for the history and so on. Sorry, not the history, but his book Irish Minstrelsy, and later on his book on Ír Connacht. The two of them remained friendly down to the time of Hardiman's death in 1855, even when many others had turned against Hardiman for outrageously selling 191 Irish manuscripts, some of them quite important, to the British Museum in 1832 for the sum of £460. But O'Donovan wasn't blind to Hardiman's shortcomings, even though he stayed in with them perhaps for his own good. And he was especially critical of the history of Galway, although he admitted, if Hardiman knew what I wrote about his book, he would become my most bitter enemy. He commented, for example, that Hardiman's knowledge, quote, of the ancient Irish language, in which he is generally believed to excel, is very slight and imperfect, and more in that vein, but I leave it there for the moment.
Thank you, Nollaig, for that. I think you left the floor there to Ciaran and to Mary to talk about the Galway of Hardiman's era as he represents it in his book. And it's, I think, as Nollaig said, it's for the modern reader, it's the most important part of it, this fairly extended and detailed account of life, including interesting detail on the lives of ordinary Galwegians in and around 1820. So, Ciaran, do you want to start the ball rolling there with part 4, as it were, of Hardiman's, his account of Galway in 1820?
He gave a very comprehensive account of the town as he experienced it then. He focused on a lot of varied features, for example, the religious institutions and houses, hospitals, bridges. He made a very large feature of the cladder as well, which was a very kind of recurring theme in travel writing. People were very much impressed with the cladder and their way of life. And so Hardiman was quite influential in that most European travel writers took their accounts of the cladder from Hardiman himself, just kind of translating or rewriting his words for their own effect. And he has given all throughout the history a lot of the background of the institutions that were still prevalent in the town at the time, and new ones he kind of gave an exceptionally detailed introduction to as well. And I'll let Mary take over.
Okay, Mary, you're on. Okay.
Well, I think one of the most important things, and particularly, I suppose, because we're talking about this period, the two buildings really, the building of the courthouse and the decisions and necessities that brought about the building of the courthouse, and secondly, the building of what we know as the Salmon Weir Bridge, which was known as the New Bridge in Hardiman's time, because it was a new bridge. It had just opened in 1819, in October 1819, and then he gives an exceptionally detailed account of the building of Galway Jail, which again, of course, many people who visit Galway now are probably not aware of the existence of it, but it was on the site where Galway Cathedral stands today. And he gives a very good description of the building itself and how it was designed and run and managed. And he even tells us about the apartments that were set aside for debtors who appear to have been given rather more comfortable accommodation than the rest of the prisoners in the jail at the time. So that type of detail, you get the feeling as well, of course, because he's writing directly from first-hand experience, that in some ways it's very authentic. And he follows that up, for example, with quoting the statistics of population for the town and also the county of the town, which I think is important to note, because the county of the town took in quite a substantial area around the city. You know, coming out maybe 2 or 3 miles in a radius from the city centre. And so he quotes the statistics from the census of 1813, which isn't regarded as somewhat defective, but nevertheless very interesting, because he breaks them down by area and everything, you know, so as a basis for further research, they would be quite useful too, I think. So it's probably the contemporary nature of the whole description that's really good for us 200 years later.
Thank you, Mary. We've referred in passing to Hardiman's other works apart from his history of Galway. I should say before leaving the history of Galway, the detail to which Mary referred to there about Claddagh and so on is available online in the online edition of the work available at Ask About Ireland and the Ask About Ireland website. So I'd encourage you to have a look at that. Now, I'm going to go to Lilith now. Lilith is going to talk about the Irish minstrelsy, which is another major work of James Hardiman. So Lilith.
My video seems to not be working.
Yeah.
Okay, start my video. Just hang on now. Yeah.
Yeah,
the minstrelsy is really interesting. It's coming, of course, after Charlotte Brooke's pioneering work in 1789, Reliques of Irish Poetry, and to some extent it reflects what's going on there, but it's a much more nationalistic book, and it was criticised for that, especially by Ferguson in a review, a long review he did. He praised it very highly for the work that he published in it, but also was rather appalled at the strong nationalist sentiments that were being expressed there. So from my point of view, the interesting thing is the song text that Hardiman published, and there are a lot of the classic songs there, and Drying on Down, which was published by Charlotte Brooke, the first folk song probably to be published. And Lisa New-Wonderle in her edition of that book says that people weren't really collecting folk songs or reproducing them in manuscripts until Charlotte Brooke published hers. And then after that, that song and other songs begin to appear in greater numbers in the manuscripts. So Hardiman's version of And Drying on Down is different to Brooke's, and he says he collected it from oral tradition. I mean, he's a very interesting figure in that he's an upper class Irish speaker. The usual narrative about the Irish language in the 19th century is people who were destitute, poor and uneducated, and this, maybe he's an exception. He had a state job and all of that, but from the point of view of the fact that he actually can, despite his shortcomings in the early language, he actually can interpret the language and doesn't really need a translator, is very interesting.
Okay, thank you, Lilith. I know you have in your repertoire some songs from that collection, and I think you're prepared to sing one of them for us. Maybe you'll introduce the song and sing it and see how that goes.
Well, I transcribed the words the way that Hardiman has them, and I'm going to sing those particular words. The Drying on Down is a song known all over Ireland, and it was collected for Brooke by Theophilus O'Flanagan in County Mayo, and Hardiman says he got his version in County Mayo as well from oral tradition. So we are seeing the rise of the interest in oral tradition at this point in the early 19th century, late 18th century, and more credit being given to it. O'Connor in his work says, oh, the people have all sorts of versions, but they're not really very, very good. That's an earlier writer, and Charles O'Connor, and now people are seeing, well, this material is there and we should be paying attention to it. So I recorded a version of this myself a number of years ago with a young singer from Donegal, but I'm going to sing the version I know from Galway, the Galway air and Hardiman's words, because the air, like everything in oral tradition, varies quite a bit from area to area and even from singer to singer. So here goes. It's a love song. It's a girl's love song, and she's complaining because the cad has left her and so on. It's a common enough theme. And Roisin White is listening in Armagh. She has a lovely version of this song as well. So I'm dedicating that song to her today. Banati Hagad Roisin. Stolekit fergerlechen min werleistamen. Stein Adrian schießtim wedesminim erchoralam. Pelin malagruarla setalia flin skawil magrasa marwanarni erdrainan down. Nielakwani gawachil gam valgachla. Snigla keleban bimarwa shame. Kegerla benivranhshe gefol vom den still tabashter es wie gewelhshe trafosirme. Ni ben bukli na hudi bergeten. Na stari gechalin begogen chil. Ach an chin nyal hirken fointigen spre. Takogam anyamowornin shninar lamwe. And there are 6 verses altogether, but that's enough for now.
Thank you, Lilith. Thank you very much. Lovely. We can't get a round of applause going across the internet, but anyway, consider yourself applauded. Now, before we go any further, I see we have a few questions coming in. I think I'm going to direct a couple of them to Ciaran, if Ciaran's available to answer them at this stage. We have a question from Teresa Kennedy, who wants to know where in Galway did Hardiman build his house? And we have Jackie Hyuna asking about the survival of primary sources about Hardiman and generated by Hardiman. And I think maybe Nollaig may have something to say about that in a little while as well. Okay, and while I'm speaking, I should say as well, I think we have a question from James Harold. He has his hand up, so if we can take James's question after Ciaran asks those, if David can arrange that. Okay, Ciaran.
Well, Hardiman's house was called Ardmore, and it was in the Taylor's Hill area of Galway. I think as far as I know, it's not still standing. It was knocked down much earlier this century or last century, but it was one that he built over several years in Galway, and it was his base in Galway. And John O'Donovan, when he came to do work on the Ordnance Survey in Galway, that was where he stayed. The second question about his primary source materials. There are some still in the Royal Irish Academy. There are, of course, his manuscripts, some of which were his originally, some of which were his that he bought, but that he sold to the British Museum that Nollaig mentioned earlier. So there are some scattered about in several repositories.
Thank you. I don't know if we've got James Harold there, who indicated he wanted a question. He raised his virtual hand some time back. Maybe he can't be found. If not, we'll await James's question. Oh no, he's James is bowed out. Okay, good, James. Right. I'm going to go over to Jimmy. We haven't heard from Jimmy O'Brien Moran yet, and we're already more than half an hour into the webinar. So Lilith mentioned that, and obviously his sources, and obviously the songs he acquired. Some of them were from people without status or perhaps a much formal education. You have an interest in one particular friend of Hardimans, I suppose a man called Paddy Connealy, who was a noted piper, and I know you've recorded an album of material related to Paddy Connealy yourself. So Jimmy, can you talk about Hardimans' relationship with Paddy Connealy, please?
Yes, so Paddy Connealy was a blind piper born probably around 1800 and died in 1851. And Hardiman was a major patron for him. Being blind left very few job opportunities for people at that time, and music was certainly one of them. And Hardiman gave Paddy Connealy an instrument, a famous instrument that had belonged to a piper named Michael Crampton, and this was actually like a major gift, really, you know. So Connealy had this wonderful instrument, and I suppose I'm sure Hardiman paid him from time to time, but Connealy frequently performed at Hardiman's house, and there's a lovely little description of it, where during the time that O'Donovan was staying at Taylor's in Taylor's Hill, also William Frederick Wakeman, who also worked for the Ordnance Survey, he was, I suppose, an assistant to O'Donovan, and he left this beautiful description, and just read it out here. And it says, at Taylor's Hill, high hospitality was kept. We generally sat down 8 or 10 to dinner, and Hardiman, like an old Irish chieftain, as he considered himself to be, had his piper Paddy Connealy at the table upon his right hand, and well the piper fared both during the dinner and after it. So it's a lovely little intimate description of the conviviality, and it sounded as if he had the best of Galway minds coming to dinner. So it was a nice little description. And there's another mention in a letter from Hardiman to O'Donovan that Paddy often comes to visit us and he's always talking about you. I didn't actually, what he said about O'Donovan sounds a little bit ambiguous as to whether or not his Irish was as a native speaker, but what was it he says? No, I don't have it there, but he said something that it sounded, wasn't it that he hadn't great Irish or something like that? It was one of these triple negatives or something like that, that you weren't sure really had he good Irish or bad Irish as his pronunciation. But so one of the interesting things is Hardiman, as a huge fan of Raftery, doesn't seem to have collected any of Raftery's tunes for inclusion in his work, and neither did he collect anything from Paddy Connealy. Now, I'm not sure if he was musically literate, and that's maybe somebody can answer that on the panel. But he did take down the words of a song that Connealy wrote in praise of Bishop Browne, possibly looking for his patronage. It's hard to know, but I'm sure he wasn't above using all his skills to improve his own lot. And so the words actually survive in that sole copy that, and actually I had sent it to Lillis, but it's difficult to read. Maybe Ciaran might be able to decipher it, a lot of it in contractions and so on, and not the clearest of handwriting either. But the melody that was collected by Henry Hudson, who was around at the time, is actually a version of Annach Choin, the same air that's used for Annach Choin, but that's not unusual that the same air is used for several different songs, you know. Yeah, I was going to play a tune if you like.
Yeah, that would be great if you could. I have a question before we do that.
Okay.
Somebody, Onion Huradan, wants the harpist, I think, you possibly know her, wants to know what area in Galway was Paddy Connealy from.
Where he was from originally, I don't know, but he lived, O'Neill says he lived in the sort of Newcastle area, but I've sort of traced it that it was actually inland and closer to Hardiman's own house. So only maybe 2 or 3 miles away from Hardiman. So it was a bit of a walk, but not too far.
Okay, and of course you mentioned Bishop Browne. That people won't need reminding that that's not the Bishop Browne of recent memory. There was an earlier Bishop Browne
Yes.
in the early 19th century. Yeah, if you could play us that tune then, Jimmy, and maybe introduce it before you do.
So Connealy had, among his collectors actually, was Hudson, who collected perhaps the most tunes from him. George Petrie collected quite a few, and Petrie actually came to visit O'Donovan and Wakeman while they were staying with Hardiman, and they were searching for Connealy and eventually tracked him down. He was on his way to play at a regatta in Kilroy's Hotel, I think. Sorry, a regatta celebration in Kilroy's Hotel, and since they couldn't really hang around, they kidnapped him by stealing his pipes and made their way up to Mam, to O'Rourke's Hotel, which is now Keen's Bar, and spent 2 weeks there and took down lots of tunes and lots of stories and so on. And actually resulting from that, George Petrie published an article on Connealy in his Irish Penny Journal in 1841. And from that, Connealy actually became quite famous, nationally at least, you know. So anyway, this, in his repertoire, lots of airs, but he had quite a few comic songs, and that's what I'm going to play now. It's a little thing called Mora Bheagnaí Giverlin, Little Mary Giblin, and it's just a nice little tune.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that.
Not at all.
Thank you for that, Jimmy. I think I'm out of the picture for the moment, but you don't need to see me anymore. There's the portrait then as well, Jimmy, of Paddy Connealy, isn't that right? There's a painting by Frederick William Burton, which you'll probably find online.
Yeah, it's an absolutely beautiful little watercolor, and the detail is very. It's quite a lot of detail in it. You can see the pipes very clearly in the picture, and you can actually see Connealy, his blind eyes, very clearly as well. So I think he was blind from birth. And again, it gives a sort of an impression of a certain amount of prosperity. He seemed to have a kind of a great coat hanging on the chair, and he was well dressed, and I think he was probably at the height of his popularity, and therefore whatever wealth he had. And he died in 1851, just shortly after the famine, and that surely impacted on him. One of the interesting things, actually, he was very popular. He performed in Dublin a number of times. He also became friendly with Lord Rossmore of Monaghan, who was also a very fine piper. And there are little mentions in the local newspapers of how Rossmore invited Connealy up to play for his daughter's baptism and so on. But it was an interesting kind of, they were all members of the Royal Irish Academy, Hardiman, Rossmore, Hudson, Petrie, of course. And it was a very interesting little circle that very few distances of separation, if you like. There's no social distancing there. They were very tight-knit circle to a large extent.
Yeah. Thank you, Jimmy. The questions are coming in thick and fast. If you've asked one, we'll try to get to it. Some of them relate to material that is coming up late on. There is an issue I see. People are being turned away. I'm getting urgent messages. I think Zoom has a capacity of just 109, and we reached that 1 minute into the broadcast. But people will be able to find it on YouTube. It's being streamed on YouTube. If you know anybody trying to get on, and also to be going up on the Moore Institute's YouTube channel, so that you'll be able to see a recording of it. Now, we have, I think, is it Deirdre Nichanila has put up her hand, which maybe we're able to admit Deirdre to ask her question. If not, I think she's texted it as well. No, Deirdre. That will come up in a little while. I have another question which I'm going to go back to Mary for, if I may. Hardiman is remembered in the name of your workplace, the James Hardiman Library. So can you tell us something about Hardiman's association with the university, and why is the library called after him?
Well, the library is called after him, John, because he was the first librarian. He was appointed as the librarian when the university opened in 1849. Now, there is indications that Dr. Edward Kirwan, who was the president of the university, actually offered him the chair of Celtic languages, but that he declined it. Now, I haven't actually seen a letter to that effect, but I've read it in other accounts. But certainly he was offered and accepted the post as librarian, for which the salary, I think, was £150 a year. And now Hardiman was getting on in years at this stage, well, certainly from the point of view of taking up a new role anyway. He would have been in his late 60s. And he had spent a good deal of the previous few years in going back to Mayo, to his native Mayo. He had endowed a monastery there, and he built a house, and he seemed to spend quite a lot of time in that house. But nevertheless, from 1849 onwards, he certainly returns to Galway, and he has the role of librarian. And in a letter to John O'Donovan, he mentions that the room which was assigned to the library was a very fine, lofty room, as he describes it, very long dimensions and so on. But at that stage, there were neither books nor shelves in the room. but apparently funding was found, and eventually they began to purchase books and so on. It's not terribly clear whether he had a budget, as we would call it today in the library, for purchasing materials or not, or whether he had to, put proposals before the library committee, which was a committee of the academics, and decide, what was to be purchased. Now, there were various booksellers who the university patronised them, and in the college calendars and so on, you see advertisements for them and lists of the books that the students would have been using and things like that. So presumably they were acquiring that type of material. There are not that many references to Hardiman himself in the minutes of the meetings of the college council, but there's quite a few references to the library itself, and particularly to things like, for example, disciplinary issues, where the students were appearing in the library without their academic robes, or maybe not looking after the library books as well as they might have been. So you don't necessarily hear Hardiman's voice that much, but you do hear how the library was going on.
That's shocking, turning up in the library without their academic robes, isn't it? Yes, indeed. There's questions coming in. I see this is one I think I'll direct to Nollaig, if I may. This comes in from Maxim Kelly, and he wants to know, I have another question which I'll hold for a moment from Deirdre Connealy. I will ask Deirdre. Maxim Kelly wants to know about how Hardiman's history was received, say by the people of Galway, if we know, and further afield, obviously. And I can add a supplementary to that. How is it received nowadays by scholars, including Dr. O'Morila himself? So, Nollaig. Are we? Can we get Nollaig back in? Right. Okay. Technical problem here, I think, in reaching the speakers. Is that right? We can get Mary, can we? If nobody else. Yeah.
I'm the only alternative, am I, John?
Not at all. No. Well, it's just he died in 1855. So
That's correct. Yes.
So
yeah, he died in office, if you like. He was still the librarian when he died. He died quite suddenly. The description in the newspapers mentions that, he had been out and about, and certainly there's a report of him attending a social event in the town about maybe 2 weeks previously. But in any case, it sounds like he got maybe perhaps a stroke or something of that sort. The description in the newspaper would lead you to believe that anyway. And his funeral was held in the Pro Cathedral, which was, of course, as we know, on the corner of Middle Street and Abbygate Street. But he was brought back then to the back of the Franciscan Abbey Church to be buried. And he had a particular association with the Franciscans, and the school that he had endowed in Mayo was a Franciscan foundation as well. So he was buried in the grounds of the Franciscan Church, but there isn't any headstone which marks the precise location,
Okay.
I think you might have got Nollaig back now.
Oh yeah, good. Nollaig, we got you. Okay, there's a question here from Maxim Kelly, which came in a few minutes ago. If I can find it again. He was talking about the reception of Hardiman's history in the Galway of the time, and more generally. And I suppose I was asking as well about how is it regarded now? How would you regard it? Okay. I can't hear Nollaig. Can you switch? Can we unmute the mic or something? No. Yes. Nolig, I think you need to unmute your mic. We can't hear you. Nolig, it can't be heard now.
It's the bottom icon on the bottom left.
Yeah, you got it. Okay, we'll come back to Nolig in a few minutes when we get that right. So there's a further question regarding Hardimans Manuscripts from Deirdre Connealy. Maybe I'll direct this to Ciaran, which is really about the most valuable of the most significant manuscript that Hardiman sold to the British Museum.
I suppose that will be up for debate according to personal research interest. But one notorious one that was included in the collection of the 191 manuscripts was Edgerton 88, which is a copy of Donald Daveron's legal glossary. The partner, I suppose, section of it is in the Royal Irish Academy, so it's only a kind of fragment of a thing that was sent over. And I think that's kind of one of the most notorious ones that was included. There was also famously a copy of Paddy O'Connell's Irish Dictionary, which Hardiman and Eugene O'Curry found themselves in a bidding war against, which Hardiman eventually won on the promise that he was going to donate it to the library of Maynooth College, and in fact then sold it to the British Museum.
Okay, thank you, Ciaran. If Nolig can hear me now, I don't think it could be heard by the audience a few minutes ago. So
I can hear you, John.
Yes, you're fine now. You can.
No, but I have no picture. But you can hear me.
But you're live now.
All right. Oh, good. No, sorry, I don't know what happened there. It just went off completely. What I was being asked about is something about the Hardiman manuscripts.
No, I was. We'd moved on. Ciaran took that one.
Okay.
I was going to ask you about the reception of Hardiman's history, which is a question which comes from Maxim Kelly.
Yeah.
At the time, in Galway, perhaps, or elsewhere, or more generally, and maybe how your own how you regard the book.
Well, okay. Well, first of all, the answer to how it was received, I don't know. It's a simple answer. The only contemporary comments I have are by O'Donovan, which are largely critical, sometimes very critical, particularly about the early part. The early history of Galway is O'Donovan considers utterly ridiculous, and indeed it is. He was influenced by General Valency and some of his rather crazy etymological theories. But how I would see it, again, I think, as I mentioned, there are two valuable aspects. The one is the number of documents that he has reproduced from the later Middle Ages, from the post-Norman period, particularly in Latin. Some of these no longer exist. They're obviously documents that he would have had dealings with when he was in the Public Records Office, and he has preserved them. Now, they're very hard going if you just, they're not light reading, as it were. But the other aspect then is the part that I mentioned earlier, his account of contemporary Galway, the matter that has been handled by Ciaran and Mary. And certainly that's a very fascinating aspect of it. The book itself is not of great, it's of kind of historical value in the sense that it's the first book on giving the history of a town or a county or any area like that west of the Shannon. There had been several books published in the 18th century and early 19th century on towns and cities, particularly in the north of Ireland, and also on Dublin in 1810. But this is the first book of any covering any area west of the Shannon, so it's important from that point of view. But as an academic work or as a work of learning, it's very unsatisfactory. And compared to Hardiman's greatest work, his choreographical description of West Connacht or Ear Connacht, the work by Rory O'Flaherty, put together in 1684. That's a magnificent achievement in comparison with his history of Galway. And if you want, I can say something about it.
Okay, yeah, go on, continue.
Okay, well, the history of Gaul, or the choreographical description, by the way, it's choreographical. It comes from a Greek word, chora. Any of us who did Greek will learn it's the first noun that you learn to decline in Greek. It means a country or a land. So I remember referring to various people, and one person published an article which they referred to it as the choreographical description, and another one called it the chronological description. But it's the choreographical description of West or Here Connacht, which O'Flaherty wrote for William Molyneux and the Dublin Society in 1684. And it's a description of the territory he calls Ear Connacht or West Connacht, namely all of northwest Galway, west from the city and from Lough Corrib, right west to Cleggan and to Clifton wasn't there, of course, at the time, and including the offshore islands, the Aran Islands, Inishboffin, Inishark, Omey, and so on. And it is a very fine work. But what's interesting about it is that O'Flaherty's text is greatly expanded by a huge amount of annotation. The edition runs to 122 pages, but the actual text runs to about 46 pages. The rest of the material would be annotation. One page, for example, page 98, has just 2 lines of text and 33 double column lines of notes running to several hundred words. So the other point is something that Lillis mentioned earlier about the Irish minstrelsy being rather nationalistic. And certainly as he went on, O'Flaherty became more in tune with the national feeling, as it were. And certainly by the time he wrote Ear Connacht, there's little or none of the kind of loyalism that you get in his history of Galway. The other, as I said, his work, the O'Flaherty text is important, but it takes up less than a third of the entire book. It's an enormous book, and the remaining 320 pages or so consist of copies of 120 different documents, 75 in English, 40 in Latin, and 4 in Irish. Many of these, again, are legal texts relating to the early history of Galway city and county, and also other counties west of the Shannon, that is the counties of Connacht, as well as what is referred to as the county of Clare and Thomond, which was kind of being half claimed for Connacht up to the end of the 17th century. And quite a few of these documents are documents, as I mentioned, that Hardiman would have dealt with in his role in the Public Records Commission, and some of them no longer exist, so therefore that aspect is very important. Now, these original documents, they're divided for reasons that aren't made clear between additional notes, that's documents 2 to 80, running to 170 pages, and then an appendix, documents 81 to 118, running for another 120 pages. And of the 2 sections, for some reason, the appendix, that's the second part, is heavily, although unevenly annotated. And without going into too much detail, my impression that many of the notes owe a great deal to O'Donovan. And this is certainly true of the Irish language texts. Whatever about the 3 songs, Boran a Fuca, Banish Fegi Niara, and Owen Cord, the fascinating Middle Irish prose text on the hereditary proprietors of Muncher Warachu, the territory in West Galway, would almost certainly have been beyond Hardiman's capabilities, and would almost certainly be the work of O'Donovan, almost in its entirety. I'm particularly interested in that text because it's the first one in which my own family, Muncher Warila, get mentioned back in the 11th century. So I'm rather proud links them with the area around Headford. One other thing that just struck me, that when Jimmy was talking there about what's his name, George Petrie, visiting Hardiman in Taylor's Hill. There's a letter that Petrie wrote to Thomas Larkham in the Ordnance Survey in 1839. It gives an insight, kind of little vignette of O'Donovan visiting Hardiman's house. He says, O'Donovan has a little room to himself in Hardiman's, filled with historical works, and he works from morning till 2 o'clock each night, and doesn't even rest on Sundays. He writes at the rate of 20 pages a day. So no wonder that O'Donovan has left so much material behind him. And just one final point, just cropped up there about original texts or original documents to do with Hardiman. There's in the Royal Irish Academy a manuscript 12N10, which is a series of letters from O'Donovan to Hardiman, in which the relationship between the two is well reflected. So it's very fascinating. It's rather one-sided because there's not much from Hardiman to O'Donovan, but there's plenty on the other side. So that's just a few ideas that I throw out.
Yeah. Thank you, Nollaig. There's questions coming in thick and fast. We're also running out of time. We've reached our hour, so I don't propose to go on for too long. But there's a question from Joe McDonough about to, I suppose, Jimmy, or perhaps to Lilith, about the how were you able to recognise the air of Anna Cohen? Did Hardiman print the airs of songs in a format we'd recognise easily nowadays? So,
well, this particular air was collected from Connealy by Henry Hudson in 1841 or 2, and so that's where we have the melody. So again, I'm not sure if Hardiman was musically literate, that he actually did any transcribing himself. Does anybody know? Any of the panel know? Did he transcribe music himself?
He did a little. In fact, there was a call to reissue the Irish Minstrelsy with notation, which was, I think Thomas Davis was one of the supporters of this. There was a letter to Hardiman encouraging him to engage in this endeavour. So I think he must have had some kind of tune collection somewhere that just hasn't survived.
Yeah.
Thank you. I don't know. I don't know if I think we're going to have to wind it up fairly soon now. Again, we've gone over our allocated hour, and excuse me. I was wondering, could we prevail on Jimmy to play us out in a few minutes? Before he does that, I suppose I'd just like to thank all the panelists. It's not easy to set things up and to communicate in this in these kind of circumstances. So people have been really heroic in making the preparations and so on over the last couple of days. I suppose we'll hear, I hope, a lot more about Hardiman in the course of the year. In the last number of months, our keynote hotel, if that's a thing, has been renamed the Hardiman Hotel, and of course our library remains the James Hardiman Library. Ciaran and I hope that our volume, which will appear in the autumn, will also be a worthy tribute to the pioneering work of James Hardiman. So with those few closing remarks, and thanks of course to the audience, and as I said before, if you think you'd like to hear a little bit more about the cultural history of Galway in later periods, which are covered in the forthcoming book, just let us know, and we'll see what we can do. So over and out to Jimmy, and thanks again to Nollaig, Jimmy, Lilith, Ciaran, Mary, and all at the Moore Institute. Okay.
Thank you very much. I'll actually finish with a composition by Paddy Connealy of a tune. I said earlier that George Petrie had kidnapped Connealy and brought him off to Mam, and so he wrote this tune to commemorate the event. He obviously wasn't too upset at being kidnapped, so he just called it Humours of Mam. Not the greatest tune in the world, but appropriate and composed obviously around 1841 or 2.
Sinead, Sloan.
Sin é.
Right.